Not sure if many of you saw this, but Anton Joly did a video discussing the argument I put forth in episode 37 of the Stalingrad series, and Anton and Brad argue that Paulus should have broken out. If you haven't seen it, I'll put a link in the description below, and I really think you should watch that video first, because he actually shows footage of German officers talking about the debate and arguing that they should have launched a breakout, so it's definitely worth watching. And one of the speakers is Colonel Zeller, who was the Chief of Engineering Services in the 6th Army. I'm a little late to the party because he made this video a couple of weeks ago, but this is brilliant. I've said it before, history lies in the heart of the debate. And now we have a debate. So I've been waiting for this sort of thing to happen because it'll be entertaining for you guys to see two historians taking opposing sides in the debate and trying to figure out which historical point of view makes the most sense. So, Anton, I understand you've had to slow your video publishing down, but I would like to see your response to the points I'm making in this video. If possible, let's do a bit of a back and forth on this. And to the audience, this isn't a TIK is an idiot because Anton made a better point sort of thing. It's not about me or Anton, it's about whether Paulus made the right decision. So I don't care whether I have to ultimately concede defeat or not, because my goal here isn't to win, but to learn whether Paulus made the right decision. If it turns out that Anton is right, then I still win, because the purpose is to discover the truth about the history. Although I suspect that it'll end up with us agreeing to disagree, because there's no way to prove either side 100%, but it'll still be worth it to have this debate. In brief, the argument Anton Joly presents is that as the Soviet pincers were moving to surround the 6th Army, a coordinated retreat wasn't possible, agreeing with what I said. But an uncoordinated retreat was possible, and it could have succeeded in getting the majority of the trapped troops out. Anton admits that hindsight plays its part here, but still thinks Paulus should have ordered a retreat. If the 6th Army had just moved en masse towards friendly lines like a human wave, it would have gotten out, and this would have benefited the overall strategic situation. And yes, with the benefit of hindsight, it absolutely makes sense, and I agree. If I was Paulus on the 22nd of November 1942, having just realised what was about to happen, I would tell my men, pick up your rifles and start walking. The majority would have gotten out, admittedly without their heavy equipment, and the overall manpower and strategic situation would have been far better than it ended up being. Even if only half of the men got out alive, it still would have been worth it. So, in hindsight, the breakout is absolutely the correct choice, even if it was uncoordinated, and I'm totally on board with this argument. What I'm trying to show though is a few things, but it can be summed up by saying, without the benefit of hindsight, it's a very difficult choice to make, and I don't blame Paulus for making it, nor do I think Paulus or Hitler or even anyone else is mad for making this decision. Let me give you 8 points, which I'll talk about in more detail once we've been through the list. Point 1 is that Paulus couldn't have ordered a breakout before the 22nd of November 1942. 2. A breakout in this period would have resulted in at least 2.5 of his corps, including the bulk of his panzer forces, getting trapped over the Don and destroyed. 3. A coordinated or uncoordinated breakout occurring from the 22nd to about the 24th of November would have had to have occurred without tanks or artillery, and would have faced enemy tanks and artillery. 4. By the time the men started walking, it would have taken a day or two before they got to the Soviet lines in order to mount that breakout. 5. There would have had to have been a mad scramble over the Rushoshka River, which formed a natural bottleneck in the pocket itself. 6. Just like what happened during the breakout of the Kherson Pocket in 1944, all the tanks and artillery and heavy equipment would have been lost. 7. This decision required the benefit of hindsight, which Paulus didn't have. And 8. Admittedly something I argued in episode 38, which is after Anton's video was published, I actually think that the German High Command was in favour of Paulus staying where he was at this time. So, as a result of all 8 of these points, I would argue that Paulus made the right decision to stay in Stalingrad. So, let's go through these in order. 1. Paulus couldn't have ordered a breakout before midday on the 22nd of November 1942. Why? Because that's when he realised his army was in danger of encirclement. I gave evidence of this in episode 37, so I won't go over it all again, but realistically, Paulus couldn't have ordered a breakout prior to this point. I also think it would have taken him a little longer to make a decision to break out, and so the earliest an order could have been given from him was probably the evening of the 22nd. So at best, the 6th Army could have started a breakout in the late evening of the 22nd or the morning of the 23rd of November. This is critical because even if the men had started walking straight away, by the time they got to the Kalach area, they would have had to have fought their way through the Soviet lines. So even though the pincers hadn't yet closed, this would have been a breakout operation, not simply a retreat. So they would have had to have fought their way out. And I think that's crucial because it lays to rest any idea that the Germans could have just simply walked out of Stalingrad. No, this was going to be a tough fight to pierce through the Soviet lines. Now, because Soviet units were still moving into the area, this means that the earlier Paulus gives the order to break out, the better chance his men will have of getting to safety. If he waits, the Soviet lines will solidify, and then it'll be even worse. This means that Paulus has to make that decision in the next couple of days in order to guarantee that the majority of his forces get out alive. And this then leads us to the next point. Point number 2, a breakout in this period would have resulted in at least 2.5 of his corps, including the bulk of his panzer forces, getting trapped over the Don and destroyed. Huber's 14th Panzer Corps, Strecker's 11th Army Corps, and a portion of Heitz's 8th Army Corps were over the Don River at this time. They faced Soviet cavalry and tank forces to their south and were thrown back by them. If Paulus ordered these forces to head south at this time, I would argue that they wouldn't have broken through the Soviet lines, or that the majority of the force would have been destroyed in the process, if it had. If Paulus had ordered the rest of his army to retreat, then these forces would have been left in a pocket in this area. If Paulus wanted to save these forces and give them a chance to escape, then he would have to pull them back across the Don first, which is what he did. This retreat ended up being chaotic in reality, even though it was meant to have been an orderly withdrawal. Officers were pulling out pistols and, trying to control crowds. Men were fighting amongst themselves. So you can imagine how much worse it would have been had Paulus told these men to just pick up their rifles and start fleeing. Therefore, if Paulus doesn't want to sacrifice these 2.5 corps, then he's going to have to wait until they at least retreat across the Don before issuing the order to break out. This ties into point number 3, which is that a coordinated or uncoordinated breakout occurring from the 22nd to about the 24th of November would have had to have occurred without tanks or artillery and would have faced enemy tanks and artillery. As I showed in episode 37, Paulus had no forces in the south with which to mount a breakout. The only actual division that was capable of doing this was the 29th Motorized Division, but they were engaged to the east. There was a huge gap between them and the 14th Panzer Corps over the Don. So in order to assemble a breakout force, Paulus had to get the 14th Panzer Corps over the Don and bring other units from Stalingrad and the northern blocking line to the Ilyanovsky area. Well, they did that in real life, and it took them until late on the 23rd just to plug the gap with some of the ad hoc Kampfgruppen. And these were then the mobile elements, including panzers of the 3rd and 60th Motorized Divisions, the 16th Panzer Division, plus parts of the 295th Infantry Division and other smaller units. Paulus therefore only really plugged the gap by the 23rd of November. Yes, this was a panzer force, but it wasn't really capable of mounting a breakout operation, and a significant portion of the 14th Panzer Corps was still over the Don. So the point of all this is to say that Paulus had very few panzers immediately available with which to conduct a breakout. And if all of his men just started walking, they wouldn't have had artillery either, whereas the Soviets had 4 tank corps and a cavalry corps in the area with plenty of tanks. They also had other rifle units nearby, and all this would have been a difficult obstacle to get through had the Germans attempted a breakout with only a handful of panzers and little to no artillery. So again, Paulus would have to wait until 2.5 of his corps were over the Don before he could realistically attempt a breakout at this time. And this leads to point number 4, which is that by the time the men started walking, it would have taken a day or two before they got to the Soviet lines in order to mount a breakout. The 103rd and 160th Panzer Battalions formed a Kampfgruppen and had moved to the Ilyanovsky area on the 23rd of November, but even though they were in a mobile panzer formation, it took them the better portion of the day to get there. Remember, there was a blizzard going on at the time, so infantry marching on foot would have taken longer. So even if Paulus had ordered a breakout on the 22nd or 23rd, the foot soldiers wouldn't have arrived until the 24th or 25th anyway, and then they would have had to face a significant number of Soviet tank units which were in the process of forming a solid line in the area. It's probable that not all the men would have arrived at the same time, and those that did would lack heavy equipment. Thus, a breakout wouldn't have been viable until the 24th or 25th at the earliest. And as we said earlier, the longer they took to mount a breakout, the worse their chances were. Paulus would have had to factor all of this in before making the decision. And as I pointed out in the series, Paulus, Manstein, and so on concluded that a breakout couldn't have been attempted before the 25th, and I think all these factors are the reason why. And point 5 follows up on this, because if we look at the map, the shape of the pocket at this time causes a bottleneck for the retreating forces. There's no way that the 4th Army Corps could have broken through the 64th Army. They would have had to have headed for Kalach in order to get out. So this meant that they have to go northwest over the Rishoshka River, along with the whole of Zilitz's 51st Army Corps. And can you imagine the chaos of all this? There would have been a mad scramble over the Rishoshka River, similar to the units flooding over the Don in a panic. Morale would have plummeted even before a breakout attempt had even started, reducing the likelihood of success, and also this would have influenced Paulus's decision to not mount a breakout. Point 6 is that all the tanks and artillery and heavy equipment would have been lost in this retreat. They couldn't bring their artillery with them because the majority of their horses had been taken away to winter quarters. Their fuel reserves were low even at this point, so not all panzers would have gotten out, if any at all, and the Kherson pocket of 1944 gives us a great example of what happened to another army trapped in encirclement. It was a mad dash to safety, the army commander was killed, and when the men got back without their equipment, their morale was so low that they couldn't be used on the front line until after they had been sent back to Germany and their units were reassembled. Had 6th Army done the same, it's unlikely that the army would have just gotten to the Chur area and then carried on fighting. Most likely they would have been withdrawn from the front in order for their divisions to be reconstructed. Thus, strategically, while the experienced manpower would have been saved, the situation in this area wouldn't have been significantly greater had a breakout occurred. And in case it's argued that the pocket wouldn't have been closed by the time the men retreated, we can look at what happened at the Falaise pocket in 1944. Obviously smaller numbers, but at best only about 2/3 of the trapped troops got out, mainly without their equipment. Some have argued half of the men got out. And nearly all their equipment was lost, including 500 tanks, and only a portion of the extracted troops were able to keep fighting after they'd broken out. So I think a similar result would have occurred at Stalingrad, and I also think Paulus would have known how dangerous this breakout operation would have been, which leads to point number 7. I would strongly argue that the breakout decision required the benefit of hindsight, which Paulus didn't have. Looking at it over 70 years after the events, and careful consideration, it's still a difficult decision to make. we have much better knowledge of the situation than Paulus ever had. We also have the benefit of hindsight, and even then we're arguing whether it should have been attempted or not. Yes, with hindsight it absolutely should have been attempted, even with all the difficulties that I've just pointed out, but at the time Paulus wasn't to know what was the right decision. And we've got to bear in mind when he's got to make that decision. At the earliest, he has to make it on the 22nd or 23rd of November. Well, what's happening at that time? Hitler's meeting with Zeitler and Goering, as discussed in episode 38. Now, admittedly, there's a lot of debate surrounding this because the primary sources are all over the place. The meeting or meetings may not have even occurred on those dates, but actually later. However, Paulus asks for freedom of action, and Hitler makes the decision to supply the Sixth Army by air. Again, with hindsight, we know the airlift doesn't work, but Paulus wasn't to know this. Neither did anyone else, except for maybe some of the Luftwaffe officers. But even the Luftwaffe Chief of Staff was saying that it could work at this time. So, Paulus is getting a direct order from his dictator telling him to stay in Stalingrad, and is being told he will receive air resupply. Assuming for a second that Paulus believed what he was being told, that they could supply the army by the air, which, without the benefit of hindsight, he hasn't got much reason to doubt, why would he risk a potentially disastrous immediate breakout? He wouldn't. The main reason to fear an encirclement is because you can't get supplies, but if you're being told by your superiors that you'll get supplies, like what had happened at Demyansk, then the main problem of being in encirclement is removed. If you can ensure that the Sixth Army is supplied by air, there's no reason to risk a risky breakout. It only makes sense with the benefit of hindsight. This then brings us to point number 8, which is that the German High Command was probably in favour of Paulus staying where he was at this time. Zeitler may have started debating with Hitler on the 23rd onwards, although Fritz and Hayward think this occurred on the 27th, but the point is that the High Command were probably in favour of the Sixth Army staying where it was. Obviously the sources are all over the place, and so this point is undermined by the impossibility of me proving this, but my suspicion, as explained in episode 38, is that it was only after Hitler had jumped on his train to East Prussia and after Jezernek had made his initial airlift calculations that serious doubts were had over whether the airlift could be done or not. That debate occurs late on the 23rd of November at the earliest, but possibly as late as the 27th, 2 days after the airlift was started. So, up until this moment, Hitler, Zeitler, Goering, Jezernek, Manstein, yes, Manstein, and I would argue von Weichs as well, were all in favour of Paulus staying where he was. Personally, I think von Weichs and Zeitler, just like Halder, inserted evidence into the narrative later to get themselves off the hook. I've pointed out some of these discrepancies in the series, and I think the idea that von Weichs was going behind Paulus's back to talk to Seydlitz about a withdrawal from the pocket is evidence enough that von Weichs was trying to paint himself as being in favour of a breakout when he actually wasn't at this early stage. But whether some of these officers were in favour or not, the point I'd like to make is that the majority of the High Command were in favour of the Sixth Army staying put at this time. Richthofen wasn't in favour, but he and Paulus had never seen eye to eye, so why would Paulus trust his opinion? I'd also argue that while Paulus was asking for freedom of action, he qualified that he only wanted freedom of action in case he wasn't able to establish a southern front in the pocket. So he would have broken out only if he wasn't able to actually form a pocket. That's not necessarily the same thing as actively wanting to break out from the get-go. Therefore, the High Command and Paulus himself, and certainly Paulus's Chief of Staff, were probably all in favour of keeping the Sixth Army where it was, hoping for air resupply and relief. And I think a strong argument can be made that tactically and operationally it was the safer option. If you assume that the airlift could work, which the High Command were doing until at least late on the 23rd at the earliest, possibly later, then the safest option is to form a pocket and wait for relief. So, without the benefit of hindsight, the obvious decision at this time is to keep the Sixth Army where it is. Only from the 24th of November onwards, depending on when you think the meeting occurred between Hitler, Zeitler and Goering, does the option of a breakout start to look more tempting without the benefit of hindsight. However, we then have Zeilitz's action and other things to consider, and I'll reserve my judgment of the period from the 24th onwards for the Battlestorm series itself, but I'd argue that without the benefit of hindsight, Paulus couldn't have called for a breakout prior to the 24th. And that was the point I was trying to argue in the series. Whether a breakout should have occurred later, we'll have to come back to discuss that. So there's my points, but there's one more thing I'd like to point out with Anton's video. Anton shows footage of German officers arguing that a breakout should have occurred, and that's fine. Technically, this is a primary source material from people who were there, and it certainly strengthens his argument. But there's a problem. These guys were speaking in the 1970s. Yes, technically this footage is classed as a primary source document because the guys speaking were there and witnessed what happened. However, I've long argued that things like memoirs and opinions given years after the date in question should really be classed as secondary sources. At the very least, they should be treated with suspicion. Why? Because they have the benefit of hindsight. These people have had the chance to change their opinions. They may have made one decision at the time and then said later that they made the opposite decision. They may have planted false evidence or opinion into the narrative to echo or influence the popular sentiment at the time, just like Halder did. They may not have had a clue what was happening at the time, but later pretended that they did. And if the idea of a breakout is super popular, which it was in the 1970s, why not cash in on that popularity? If the German generals are amazing Super Saiyans and blaming Paulus as the popular, easy get-out-of-jail-free card, why not go along with it? Yes, these people may not be doing this sort of thing consciously. They may not even be doing it at all. But it's something to bear in mind. I would place more emphasis on evidence recorded at the time than the opinions of veterans given decades after the events in question. Things like diaries, reports, letters, or even just looking at the map and thinking logically, which is part of the reason why I'm doing the Battlestorm series, I think are more reliable sources of information than memoirs or opinions given many years later for this reason. Also, Colonel Zeller isn't a major player in the Stalingrad story. He may have not been privy to all the information that Paulus had, and while it's easy to say, in the safety of a film studio decades after the event in question, with the benefit of hindsight, that the 6th Army should have broken out, had Colonel Zeller been in the driving seat himself, I wonder if he would have been so confident of that decision. Finally, one of your commenters, a guy called Luigi, suggested something that I've never heard before, and I wanted to highlight it here. He says, I would have divided the 6th Army into two corps, one with the wounded, the heavy material, and the soldiers less able to undertake a sudden retreat, taking into account the adverse weather reports and the fog, would defend the city and, incidentally, pin down the Soviet troops. At the same time, another army corps would boldly begin a retreat in autonomous battle groups led by brave officers. In this case, in coordination with Paulus and in turn with the high command through him, the places to which they were trying to reach in a long retreat would be known in advance. This would mislead the Soviets and facilitate a possible air supply closer to the German front. As you said in response, this is an interesting idea. I can imagine the 51st and 4th Army Corps forming a hedgehog around Stalingrad itself, perhaps with a division or two from Heitz's corps, and then the other corps and mobile elements making a breakout attempt to the southwest. This has the added advantage of having most of the mobile elements in the southwest. But I still don't think Paulus would have made this decision. If he would have, then maybe we would have heard about it before now. I also think the points I raised earlier would have made it a difficult operation in the circumstances, but I do think this is an interesting take, and maybe it would have seen some of the divisions getting out. It probably would have sacrificed most of the infantry units though, and I'm not sure if the remaining troops would have been able to hold onto the airfields needed to resupply. So while a handful of divisions may have gotten out, those that remained would have been devoured within a matter of days once their ammunition supply ran out because of the lack of airfields. Still, it's a great idea, and I'm surprised this hasn't been thought of before. You don't have to treat the 6th Army as a monolith. We can split it up if we have to. Anyway, I now hand over the baton to Anton, and when he makes a response, I'll display his video here on the screen, and I'll leave a link in the description as well. Until then, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Could Paulus have made that decision to break out, even without the benefit of hindsight? Let me know. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.